Welcome to Cracked, the podcast, the program that slays the dragons of mental health by stripping away the shame, embarrassment, fear, and stigma. Because mental health isn't something that affects just some of us, it applies to all of us. Here to shine a new light on areas of mental health that often go unvisited are your hosts, Rebecca Schaper and Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome to Crack the Podcast, Slaying the Dragons of Mental Health with me, Sandie Sedgbeer.
And me, Rebecca Schaper.
Now, we all know people whose lives would be so much better if only they would listen to our advice and change. We argue, criticise and fight with parents, partners, loved ones and children who don't do what we want them to do because we believe that we know what's best for them. But the truth is, regardless of how well-meaning our motivations are, pushing others to change is never going to work. But there is a secret biological key that will. Joining me and Rebecca this week to explain the biological mechanisms that affect our ability to let go of behaviours, habits, thought patterns and addictions that don't serve us and open us up to new ideas that create genuine lasting change is expert in the field of emotional intelligence, behavioural change and competence, Professor Richard Boyatzis. Richard Boyatzis is a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University, as well as a professor in the departments of organisational behaviour, psychology and cognitive science. He's also the author of over 200 papers and 9 books, including one that reveals the secret we'd all like to know, which is called Helping People Change, Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth. Richard Boyatzis, welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to have you with us. Now, before we start, I'm intrigued because you received your bachelor's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT before obtaining your MS and PhD in social psychology from Harvard. What prompted that switch from science and designing control systems in interplanetary vehicles to helping people change?
Well, it's still science to me. I mean, I'm always a scientist, but my parents immigrated from Greece. My father made it to this country just in time to be enlisted in the army and land on Omaha Beach and all those things. So by the time he gets out of the army, he was a waiter and I grew up a working class life. So I'd always dreamed about being in space, from the 50s on. And even though the public school systems had tried to lead me back because they thought I was cognitively slow in New York City. Back in 1950, if you spoke with a Greek accent and could read Greek but not English, you were considered retarded in some way, not multicultural. At any rate, all that went smoothly. I got recognized for my strength when I was about 12. They put me into these high-speed courses. I got into MIT. I was living my dream, but I ran out of money. And so MIT got me a job doing design of interplanetary vehicles. I worked for Northrop Air for 6.5 months, or just about, and discovered that I just didn't like the work. I mean, day to day, it was computer programs, and the 2 departments we had in the research unit at Northrop were like 2 units of Sheldons, if you follow Big Bang Theory. Really people who are all very scary smart, but have trouble making eye contact. So that was when I decided I would have to make a change. I didn't want to go into the restaurant business. Every male in my extended family on this side of the Atlantic was in restaurants in New York City. I'd done it for a number of summers. I didn't want to do it anymore. I didn't think my music, which helped me to pay my way through MIT, was good enough for me to go fully pro. So I said, okay, I'll have to go into management. Look at these idiots we had in these 2 departments, because I thought they got very little out of us compared to what they could. And that was when I signed up for some management courses at MIT and discovered the field of psychology, which honestly I thought was bull up until that point. And started doing research on behavior change in the spring of 1967. By the following year, a number of people who are kind of later I learned were giants in the field, became my mentors, Ed Schein, Dave Kolb, Dave McClellan, and a lot of others. And they convinced me that I should be in psychology. So that was the crosswalk. And fortunately, with their help and my willingness to sacrifice everything in life, including my physical health and relationships, to get through school, because I had to pay my way through school with after-tax income, which in the U.S. is prodigious. So it all worked out, and it was just amazing because I found that if I dressed up, and back in those days, you went to doctoral seminars with a tie and a suit coat and all that. And at MIT, there weren't any women, so that it wasn't that there was a different dress code. At Harvard, there were, but people didn't know I was so unread in psychology. Except for Benjamin Franklin's autobiography that I read when I was 10 or something, I'd never read anything about that. So, but what grabbed me was the fundamental issue of how people help somebody else learn, get excited, and do something. And that's what I saw most managers I encountered not able to do. And then I have to say most professors couldn't do that either. So it became very clear. And by the time my 1982 book came out with the empirical study of executives and managers at all levels in 12 large organizations against performance, it became clear, which still holds today, that 70 to 80% of the people in management or leadership jobs aren't adding value. And in fact, the organization would be better if they were pulled out of the job and just done. And by the way, this applies in politics too. What we have is people who are in influence positions really seem to be out to lunch when it comes to humans. And that was what drove me. So by the time I finished my doctorate, my PhD, I turned down a teaching job for an offer at Yale because I didn't want to teach. I wanted to do research and therapy. And I was doing therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts for most of the 70s. And that was where it became very clear to me that almost everything we do in psychotherapy, in teaching, in trying to help people, any kind of clinical social work, any of those fields, didn't have much impact. I mean, when Eysenck did his study to show that in the UK, people on a waiting list for 1 year improved in their mental health as much as people who went through 1 year of psychotherapy, it was pretty humbling for those of us in the field. So that set me on the quest to try to figure out right from the very beginning, what's the process? And because I was working with, alcoholics and drug addicts, I had to work physiological issues as well, with fractionated catecholamines and all these kind of hormones. And then as I shifted, because that work, after a number of years and after almost 10 years of doing it and averaging like 18 days of group therapy a month, I was going bananas myself. So I shifted to working on leadership and management because you also didn't have to, sell your soul to try to get enough money to do the research. And then, when I decided I'd had enough of doing this out of the base of research companies, and I'd built the company I was in up to 100, 110 folks, and then another company in market research, I just decided, okay, that's it. For my self-preservation and that of my marriage, I had to stop and I had to do something where I didn't feel like I had to always toe the party line. And colleagues that I'd known at MIT and Harvard were on the faculty at Case Western Reserve. They invited me out. And although I had a number of other offers, they offered me tenure walking in the door. So I said, sure. And since 87, I've been very specifically looking at 25 to 65-year-olds. How do they change?
We are so glad that you did not work in a restaurant because
Yes, I agree.
Rebecca and I have both said, your book And the work that you're doing is so important and so fascinating and so multi-stranded as well that, we're riveted.
Very much so. Yeah. It's you have a plethora of information, and I just really appreciate how you're going about this.
And thank you for appreciating that. I've got to say it's not without its detractors, and along the way, getting the actual studies published has always been a major pain because we keep going against the grain.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the things that became very clear in our neuroimaging studies, that when you approached a person a certain way, you activated the neural networks that allow you to be open to other people and ideas. The classically called the default mode network. My colleague Tony Jack prefers to call it the empathic network. But very often, those of us in the field of trying to help with mental health do the exact opposite. Well intended. So one of the arguments I used to have with psychotherapists and training programs, even for clinical social workers and pastoral counselors in the 70s, was stop wallowing in the negativity. And now I can honestly say we've got the data to suggest that if you keep encouraging somebody to tell me more about, how your life sucks or how horrible this situation is, or, all of these things about your relationships, your marriage, your kids, all you do is send the person down a spiral of negativity, which closes them to new ideas, doesn't open them up. So what we used to call empathy, in fact, it was enabling. So that's one discovery. Second, you have to validate that a person's, kind of feeling bad or traumatized. But I would say if you spend more than 3 minutes in that zone, you're hurting them, not helping them. So part of it is, even in a coaching session, nevertheless a more therapeutic session, you'd say, that really sounds horrible. Let's get back to that. But first, let's step back and help me with the bigger context. And it's the bigger context. Right now I'm going up against, and my colleagues and I, Ellen and Melvin and others that are working with us, are going up against the entire kind of coaching field, of which, I'm on the board of the largest coaching organization, and Melvin is the president of one. But they all say to get certified, you have to be very clear about what the client's presenting problem is and take that as the context of your conversation. I just explained why that would be foolish. Then there's another group that says, well, you got to be specific on the goals, get it measurable. And I published with Dave Kolb one of the early studies that showed being more specific helped you change. Well, we now know that it might help you, but it doesn't help sustain you.
Yeah.
So specific goals might be useful later in the process, but early on, they activate a part of the sympathetic nervous system, which closes you down. So, I think that's what happens with most parents. When your teenager, gives you a whatever, or, won't look at you in the face, but looks at their phone all the time, it's pretty frustrating. So what do? You start to try to be understanding, but then you just get fed up and said, put the phone away, or I'm taking it away. Now, I'm not saying you always have to be compassionate, and I'm not saying you always have to be positive. In fact, I think people who believe that are living in a fairyland.
Yeah.
Or they levitate a lot. I don't know. But the question is, and this is where the physiological hormonal stuff became very, very clarifying. What's the balance? Because it's all a choice, a set of balances. We need to be analytic and we need to be empathic. We need to be what I would call pulling to the positive emotional attractor and sometimes to the negative. If you didn't pull to the negative, or the NEA, as I call it, which includes a sympathetic nervous system, you couldn't wake up. You wouldn't wake up in the morning. You couldn't decide what to have for dinner. So we need it. But what becomes very clear is that because negative emotions are so much more powerful than positive ones in our psyches, and eliciting fear starts to create a chain reaction of seeing everything as threatening. That what we have to do is oversample, if you will, the positive. And, I mean, John Gottman showed in a whole several decades of studies that healthy, loving marriages have a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative statements and affect and facial expressions in 20-minute segments of sampling a couple. Barb Fredrickson showed that in teams, a 3-to-1 ratio could predict team effectiveness. We're suggesting somewhere between 2 and 3-to-1 is what you need to do when you're doing coaching or counseling. But the really crucial issue is, and this next thing I want to say, we've known, any of us in the field have known for many decades. The context is what's really important. And what we're finding is so far, there are 2 things in context, the setting, that can help somebody sustain the energy it takes to keep coming back to it. One is a dream, a deep sense of purpose or vision. And the other is a caring relationship with the person you're talking to.
Yeah.
It goes back to what Carl Rogers had said in the 60s, unconditional positive regard and genuineness and accurate empathy. I mean, I think those are still pretty good. It doesn't mean, on occasion need a little bit of Fritz Perls with the reality testing vengeance that he used to have, but you have to take it in balance. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Libra.
You're not saying that because what?
I'm
He's
a Libra.
Oh, so am I. When is your birthday?
October 1st.
Mine's the 11th.
Oh,
We're all about balance.
7 of the 9 planets, I still include Pluto, were in Libra on the hour I was born. So,
wow. That really is a nice hefty load there. I'd be very interested to know which ones. You basically mostly work with executives in the business arena, but everything that you say relates to all of us. Whether we're a teacher, a minister, a parent, especially a parent. That's where I take it. And since reading your book, I have been talking to my children about how to talk to their children. But, I remember reading many years ago, because I've always been interested in psychology. One of our top psychologists at the time in England was talking about relationships are built upon reward. And at the time I thought, that doesn't sound very good. But once I understood what he was saying, and what you're saying in a nutshell is when we start trying to get someone to change and we criticize them or hound them or point out everything that's wrong, there's no reward in that for them.
Right.
But when we do what you've suggested and what your all your studies show and the neuroscience shows is approach them in a different way, then they light up. There's a reward.
Actually, most of my work for the past number of years has been in hospitals. I'm on the board, one of the boards at MD Anderson, which is the largest cancer treatment hospital in the U.S., and on our nursing school, and I serve on a lot of committees at our medical school. So I spend a lot of time in healthcare because these issues are even more acute, and we've got data to say the approach we're talking about really helps treatment adherence. Yeah. But it comes down to this basic issue of, is the organism, is the person feeling, if I put it simplistically, in a stress mode or in a renewal mode? Now, technically, it's sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic. But what we forget is that there's no neutral. If you say, well, I'm ambivalent, that means you're negative. Okay. If you say, well, I don't really care where we go for dinner, it means you're negative. You may be mildly negative, but you're negative because the human body can't stay midpoint between these systems, hormonally and neurologically. So what happens is, it is the annoying stress that builds up to us. This is pre-COVID, builds up to a level where we're cognitively and perceptually and emotionally impaired. When you add to that, certainly what we've been going through for the past year and a half, the acute stress of COVID, of the virus by itself, the acute stress of people worrying about financial flows in their living, the acute stress of political disruption, which has been happening in every country, and the acute stress of social disruption, very often begun in the name of social justice. But nonetheless, when people are breaking windows and setting cars on fire, it's scary.
Yes. Yes, it is.
It is.
So I think what happens now is we're dealing with a different world. And in fact, a lot of the articles I've been reading is every journal I am a part of is doing special issues on COVID. And the consistent message, especially in the healthcare and in the psychology journals, is long COVID's a bigger worry than the current hospitalization. I mean, as soon as you get the vaccine. If you didn't get the vaccine, I don't know. I'm not one of these people that says anything you feel is okay. I actually think we have a social responsibility to get vaccinated. But aside from that, the real issue is going to be the long-term mental health issue. And right now, people looking at it are suggesting we've got 2 years after we've concluded that we've licked the COVID medical virus to deal with, to keep dealing with the mental health problem. I mean, the social isolation alone, as you know, is horrible.
And people are getting so many mixed messages too. I think that's very frustrating and adds to the stress, the anxiety. They don't know who to trust.
And I've got to say, the politicians on all sides have just really done us a disservice.
Yeah.
I mean, I was disappointed in the U.S. Although Donald Trump would say, wear your masks and don't go in groups, and then he wouldn't demonstrate it. And then Kamala Harris and I don't think Joe Biden did it, but he didn't say much of anything in the campaign. But Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and the former governor of New York and the governor of California all said they refuse to take the vaccines that are approved under a Trump administration. So you wonder why there are a lot of people in those places that aren't taking the vaccine. What both sides did was they politicized something that isn't political.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are we about ready to go to break, or can I ask a question, Sandie?
Yeah, let's get a quick question in and then we'll take a brief break.
Okay. Can you give us an example of how we can connect to someone's positive vision of themselves, or an inspiring dream, or goal they
The issue of getting somebody into the dream mode is not that difficult. One of the things I would say is ask the basic question. And in fact, my graduate students are 35 to 65-year-olds that are physicians, executives, teachers, etc., therapists. And, I get them to practice this in some of the assignments where you start a conversation with somebody and you say, help me out with your big picture. If your life were fantastic, if everything were perfect in 10 to 15 years, what would it be like? And if somebody stumbles a little bit, then you throw at them the lottery question. Okay, you won $80 million after tax. And I'm talking about US dollars, not Australian. After tax, how does your life or work change? Either one of those things, for most people, unless people have been traumatized by political oppression or injury or sexual abuse, things like that. But aside from people traumatized, people all of a sudden start to sit back and you see the genuine Duchenne smile and you see them, oh, wow. And, and I love the example when people respond to the lottery question. They say, well, I'd pay off my mortgage and I'd set aside money for all of my children and grandchildren's college education. And my response is, with 80 million after tax, if you invest it in a reasonable portfolio of mutual funds, you're pulling in $4 million a year, every year. So you just allocated half of the first year to all these things. What else?
Yeah.
And when people start to play with that, it's amazing.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Regardless of what people are doing, they start to talk about what they would love to be doing. And now for some people, they love what they're doing now. But, there are a lot of people who have gotten stuck and they want to open a shelter for abused women, or they want to open a refugee shelter, or they want to help the art museum raise money. I mean, there are a lot of things, and sometimes it's business. People want to start their own businesses. But the issue, that's why I call our approach when I'm talking to the actual graduate students, I call it liberation education. Because I'm trying to help us set people free.
Yes.
Now, again, I have to be, as a former clinician, I have to be careful. I am not talking about people who are currently traumatized or people who are medicated, self-medicated or otherwise, because all of the range of medications squelch a lot of conscious awareness.
Yeah.
What is your approach on prescription medication?
There's too much of it. I mean, back in the 70s, when I was doing all this group therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts, I was training therapists. The feds in the U.S. paid me to train therapists in 15 cities around the U.S. And regardless of whether I was dealing with lobbyists and military people and lawyers in D.C. area, or farmers who could only think of how exciting it would be to go deer hunting in northern Vermont, or convicted murderers that have gotten out in San Antonio, didn't matter where or what their social status was. The women all had prescription bottles of tranquilizers in their purses.
Wow.
Because through the 70s, and I would contend still, an awful lot of male physicians see women with alcohol and other addiction problems as hysterics, and they treat them with tranquilizers. That's absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying tranquilizers can't be useful for some people,
Right.
but, and we start prescribing Ritalin to teenagers, knowing that with teenagers, with adolescents, something like Ritalin actually has a bipolar effect. It can send you off the wall or calm you down. And unless you've got some very careful genetic screening, and I think the current opioid crisis is evidence that we overprescribe. And I even, because I do this personally, I interpret obesity, which is a problem in pretty much every country of the world, being a function of the fact that we self-medicate on comfort food with too many fats, too much salt, too many calories. And I know when I'm teaching an all-day event, and at our executive education center at the university, they'll have pastries out for breakfast with fruit, and in between they'll have snacks with coffee and tea, and they always have freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. And I'm a diabetic, and I know that my biggest problem is when I'm halfway through a morning for 3 or 4 hours and halfway through the afternoon, I go down to that snack thing, and I unfortunately will opt for something with sugar. I stay away from the caffeine. I'm taking too many pills to control my blood pressure, but I don't stay away from the sugar. And so I don't think this stuff is easy, but I do think we over-medicate.
Yeah,
definitely.
A lot of the techniques that we talked about, Dan Goldman and I had a new test that we published validation studies on back in March that we've been working on for about 6 years, trying to look at the balance of renewal versus stress activities. We call it the Personal Sustainability Index in an ordinary week. So unlike the prior things that look at divorce or horrible thoughts like death of a child or something, we were saying, look at the ordinary things you walk into. And it became very clear what most of us have been saying for a long time. You need more renewal episodes in a week than stress.
Yeah.
And the thing that I finally could get some proof for, the variety of things you do is just as important. Yeah. So, I mean, I used to say to the patients that I had in the 70s, the same thing I'm saying now to executives. You can't get healthy by stopping some things that are stressful and then working out for 8 hours a day, because you've traded addiction.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the kinds
Richard,
of things
I'm going to have to hold you there just for a minute because we really do need to go to the break. But this is really important, and I really want to pick up on this again when
definitely.
we come back. You're listening to
the thoughts.
Yeah, you're listening to Crack the Podcast with me, Sandie Sedgbeer, and my co-host Rebecca Schaper, and we're talking to Dr. Richard Boyatzis about helping people change. We'll be back with more from Dr. Boyatzis after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Worried about your friend but don't know how to reach out?
You could say how are you or get a fake tattoo. You could ask with an app if it works for you. You could chat with them in VR. It's all good if you think you should check in. Yeah, you should.
Whatever gets you talking. Reach out to a friend about their mental health. Whatever gets you talking. Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back. Richard Boyatzis, one of the things that I want you to pick up on, you've talked about this in your classes and in your articles and your book. In the workplace, things have got so serious and people have to work long hours. And, you know, if you don't work over the normal hours, then, you know, you're shirking it. You made a really good point with taking away cut down lunch breaks, taken away tea breaks. We've condensed this day. It's nothing but pressure and stress. And in fact, people don't think about those, you know, trips to the water cooler. They're necessary.
Yes.
I had this instinct all along because I did my PhD thesis on unconscious drives to intimacy. So I've been railing about the loss of our relationship since way before the internet. You know, and then between the internet and all this stuff and social media, which is really very antisocial, it strikes me that, yes, there are things we can individually do to help the renewal process. Meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, modest physical exercise, prayer to a loving God. But a lot of the things that we do that stimulate the renewal process, the parasympathetic, which enhances your immune system and helps you grow new neurons in your brain, by the way. So are interpersonal, helping others in need, helping others less fortunate, helping the elderly. Each one of these have 5 or more published studies showing how they work. I mean, I tell my graduate students, helping your elderly professors really helps. Being in a loving relationship, having a dog, cat, horse, or monkey. I mean, in other words, something you pet works really powerfully.
Yeah.
But being playful with others does. And I was saying to Ellen and Melvin, my 2 co-authors on this book and colleagues on a lot of things we've done, the MOOCs and all sorts of other things, what I miss the most, because we still try to get together for several hours on Zoom once a month, but I miss being at school and seeing each other in the halls, because you have these 2-minute interactions, which usually, give you a touch point, a check-in, a laugh or something. And you feel, I'm not isolated. I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to talk about how in management training, every organization in the world wanted to make it less and less days because they thought it would be more efficient, and how we all knew for decades that if you spread out any change effort over time, it's much more likely to work. I mean, a lot of them don't anyway, and then companies come along and say, well, we don't want people that much time off work, so let's do it in 1 week. Let's do it in 5 days. Let's do it in 3, start at 7 in the morning, go to 10 at night. And the same thing with these people who want to cut out lunch breaks and coffee breaks and things like that. I call it the suppository theory of learning. Sorry, it's kind of an off, simile, but this is the notion, that you really condense it, and then just give it to people, and it's not going to help. It's not going to help.
Right.
Breaks are what we physiologically need. Yeah. And if the breaks are interpersonal, not that you stop and play a violent video game, but if you stop, one of the rituals my wife and I started, not just when COVID started, but we started before, is at our house here, because we have one condo in Boston, and then right now I'm here at our house on the beach on the Atlantic in Cape Cod, is that around 9:30, because I usually start work, I come up to my office around 7:30 or 8, but around 9:30 or 10, I stop what I'm doing. I go downstairs. If she's working in the garden, I'll call her and I'll make her a cappuccino. I'll make a cup of tea. We'll spend 15 minutes just talking about whatever, but and including, whether or not it's going to rain and all this kind of stuff. And there have been a few times I've had webinars back to back, and I couldn't do that. And I felt guilty, not just because I was letting her down. I was also letting me down. I needed those touch points.
These bits that you're talking about, they play into something else that Rebecca and I have been watching some videos of you, and that is the emotional contagion. Because if we're not getting that upliftment,
right,
what are we transmitting to others?
Yeah,
more stress.
Joseph Ledoux's work back in around 2000 showed that when you have two sentient beings, although his original work was with mice, but we've got later evidence to suggest the same thing happens with humans, that they telepathically stimulate each other's central limbic system with the emotions that they're feeling, not the ones you're expressing, not the ones you think you are hiding, but the ones you're really feeling. And it happens in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. It's deeply unconscious.
Yeah.
So, my take is, when I'm talking to all these physicians and nurses and sometimes executives or teachers or coaches, you've got to tend to yourself first. Because if you're feeling not, the music isn't ringing in your ears, if you're not feeling inspired, you're not going to inspire anybody else.
Exactly.
Even if you think you can mask it. Few of us are as good as Denzel Washington or Meryl Streep at hiding the emotions that we, or changing. Because I think they actually don't hide the emotions. I think they actually change their emotions. So the real issue, you're right, is how to infect others with the thing that works rather than the stuff that doesn't.
Well, it's neuroscience has revealed so much to us about the way we live and how we're not doing it right, that it seems to me that, Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, we need a whole new book like that to grab people's imaginations and show them, no, this is the way, to succeed and be happy in life.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very interesting. If you look at bestseller lists, and decades ago, my former thesis advisor and good friend for many decades, Dave McClellan, used to do that. He would code first grade books and used it to predict economic development 25 years later in 140 countries around the world, and code. So he and I worked on some projects where we coded popular bestsellers or even music. But look at what hits the best-selling nonfiction list. And, we've had these waves of books since 95 when Dan Goleman's book EQ hit.
Yeah.
We had these waves of several books around emotional intelligence. And then occasionally somebody else comes along and, Malcolm Gladwell takes a different approach to it, but he says a lot of the same things. Adam Grant, who's at Wharton, the same thing. And you start to find this quest for, I don't know how to say it other than inner peace and interpersonal harmony.
Yeah.
Melvin and I caught a lot of crap from colleagues, scholars, and got rejected in a lot of our papers because we were using the term coaching with compassion. Because they said, compassion's only when you help somebody in pain. Well, we said we're taking a Confucian approach, which you can, some people erroneously credit it to Aristotle, which as a Greek, I would love to give credit to Aristotle, but actually Confucius said it a few hundred years earlier, which is that you can reach out to someone and care about them who's in a hedonic situation where they're in pain or suffering. You can also do it when it's eudaimonic, when they want to grow, when they're looking for variety. And, I was just talking to some folks yesterday on a webinar. One of the things that organizations are having to do right now is completely revamp their idea of how do you attract or keep anybody you want to keep. Because retention is the major game now.
It is. Can you give us examples of coaching with compassion?
Yeah. We talk about this opposition, which, Sandie or Rebecca? Sorry, Rebecca. Okay. Sandie, you mentioned this earlier. We contrasted when you coach to the other person's desires, values, and dreams versus when you're laying, as you said at the beginning, Sandie, your intent for them. Yeah. This is what you should do. It's what I call the Inlaw phenomena, where they're telling you how to dress your kids, even if you're in your 50s.
We call them the outlaws.
Right. It doesn't stop when the kids are in their 50s either. But anyway, but it's this hegemony of oughts. And while I do think expertise is important, there are a lot of people who develop this thing, as you said at the beginning, where they believe they know better and they're going to tell people. Mm-hmm. Now, look, certainly in a number of countries of the world, the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada are prime examples. Scandinavia is another one. We have a lot of suspicion about centralized authority. And in contrast to those cultures that respect centralized authority and do whatever, we don't culturally. And part of the dilemma is you start to worry about who's messing with not just choices you should be making, but your motivation. And when we do coaching for compliance, even though we're well-intended, we're still becoming a helping bully. And that's the dilemma. Now, look, there's sometimes you need to do it. If you have a 3-year-old who's about to touch a hot stove, you need to tell them not to touch the hot stove. That's right.
You need to
but for most of us, most of the time, it'd be so much better. Here's an example. Decades ago, for 8 years, I was department chair. And this is years after I'd finished running these 2 consulting companies and all that. And one of the really great faculty members would come in, and I would need to do the equivalent of a performance review. You wouldn't be that crass and call it that, but you'd say kind of an annual chat with each faculty member. And I would always start by saying, how's the year been for you? How did you think you did? Out of the 14 full-time faculty that I was responsible for doing this for, 1 had illusionary answers. Everybody else did a better job of answering it than if I answered it to them. And I used to do this with the consultants, the full-time. So the idea of asking somebody to do their evaluation first ends up being an example, because now I have the ability to say, you're right. And then my next question is, how do you feel about that?
Yeah.
Rather than me telling them something and them getting all defensive and Wes getting into a tug of war. So, I mean, that's not a cure-all, but it's one little example. Starting meetings. If you start a meeting, whether it's a weekly staff meeting or a monthly or a big project meeting or whatever, all too many people start meetings with financials, even in nonprofits, even in hospitals. And I've been saying for decades, show me a manager or executive who starts a meeting with financials, I'll show you an ineffective leader. We need to deal with financials, but if you open with it, what does it say to everybody in the room?
Yeah.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And especially in healthcare or in universities or anything like that, that's the wrong message. Now we have data to say when you start with abstract numbers, you go into the analytic mode, which causes people to close down their openness to new ideas. So when you have this model of the executive haranguing the people in the room about, we've got to think outside the box, they can't, because they can't see the box. I mean, some London psychologists did this study, I don't know, almost 20 years ago, where they used nasal sprays to what we call epinephrine and oxytocin to get sympathetic versus parasympathetic arousal. And they showed that people's peripheral vision, which is normally 180 degrees, most people, if you stare straight ahead, you can usually see things without thinking about it, about to there, goes down to 30 degrees under the stress, and then it goes back under the oxytocin. So what happens is meetings very often should start with either something about purpose, like, why are we here? Not, oh, how well are we doing? Why are we here? Let's talk about the vision. Talk about the dream. I know one very effective leader of a healthcare system that went from one hospital to 16 vehicles, some 9 general hospitals and 7 outpatient clinics, who used to open the 1 hour, 60-minute meeting with the heads of all the units each week in his office by having 2 of them each tell one story of a patient who was helped the prior week in their hospital. He surrendered, Tom Strauss, he surrendered 5 to 10 minutes of his 60 minutes, and he reminded all the people in the room that they're there to heal people, not to make budgets.
And show them that he cares. He cares about it. He cares what they're doing, their purpose. Right. He has an interest. Yes.
What you're talking about.
I'm sorry, Sandie.
I was going to say, what you're talking about is fundamental humanity. That's the thing that we've been losing in order to be so organized and efficient. This is the crux of it.
And another example on Zoom, I mean, Ellen Van Oosted, who was back in the 90s, one of my students, and then became my boss, in terms of various things, and as she's been doing her, become a senior faculty member and doing all this phenomenal innovation. I mean, she's actually one of my coaches. And one of the things that she always was very good at, I mean, I study emotional intelligence. I'm not as good at it. I mean, ask my wife. But Ellen's so good at it. And she would start meetings and say, okay, let's do a check-in. Well, over time, I started to see, that wasn't just wasting time or overhead. It was actually useful. Now, during all of these Zoom things, it is imperative.
Yes.
Because we don't have these hallway brief conversations. So we need the emotional check-in.
Yeah.
So again, we're dealing with values and vision, purpose, or we're dealing with the quality of the relationships. All of it, though, you're right, is being human.
Yeah. And this is something that we really do need to reorganize everything. The way we work in mental health, in hospitals, as you say, in every area. I mean, one of the things, we don't have much time left, but one of the things we did want to talk about was Kyle Schwartz. You wrote about the teacher
Yes.
who approached her students in a completely different way. That made a big impact on me. And I bet it made a big impact on those kids.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us
No, that
quickly
was
the
such
story.
an emotional thing. I mean, I read about it in the New York Times Sunday magazine section, I think it was, and then I bought her book and went on her website. So I have never even talked to her, but she's a heroine in my view. She asked her, I think they were third graders, if I recall, or maybe younger. She said, "Finish the sentence. I would like my teacher to know." And what the things they said would bring tears to anybody's eyes. And, like I wish my teacher knew that my family and I sleep in our car. I wish my teacher knew that I haven't seen my father for 8 months because he's in prison. I wish I knew, and all of these things. And you stop and ask yourself, if we had the quality of relationships with folks that we work with, we wouldn't have to wallow in that. We don't have to fixate on it. But it would be a thing to make sure we're listening. I mean, I started writing, when Melvin, Ellen, and I had divided up the chapters in the book. And so I started writing the chapter I was writing, which I thought was going to be about one thing. And I ended up realizing it had to be about how to focus on the other person. And I got so moved as I got into that perspective on it that I did the first draft for the last chapter, and I wanted to call it "Get Over Yourself." But our editor and Ellen and Melvin both said, no, it's too negative. The whole book's positive. So I opened with the notion we live in an increasingly narcissistic world. Every culture. I mean, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? And with this narcissism and with the escalating threats, both real, acute, as well as mild, everybody's getting very self-righteous.
Yeah.
The only antidote to this is to care.
Yeah.
And I think the more we can return to these various notions of how to be genuinely and openly human with each other. I mean, it's not a new idea, but we need it a lot right now.
Yeah.
I think it starts with us.
Right.
It starts with us. That's to me, that's how you do it. The example. We are.
And those of us who work in helping organizations, I mean, when I was doing a lot of my work, even before I finished my PhD, but then afterwards in hospitals and healthcare systems, USVA and others, I ended up being struck by, and I finally wrote an article, which I don't think I ever published, but called the Schizophrenic Message of Helping Organizations. Because in hospitals, whether we're inpatient, locked wards, or ambulatory units, in schools, people didn't treat each other the way they treated the patients or the students. Now, in retrospect, I don't think they treated the patients or the students all that well either, but nonetheless, the common thing to look at is everything goes to the student and then you treat each other like furniture, which doesn't make sense. So I think that even in healthcare, mental health care, part of what we need to do is just fess up and realize if we're not modeling it, if we're not living it, nobody's going to believe us.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is so true. Richard, I'm afraid that we're out of time. Everything that you've said, I mean, I don't know where to start, because this is so fundamental to living life. This is the answer to all of the problems of the world, all of the wars, all of it. And it's so important. And we really hope that this book gets an awful lot of attention. And if it doesn't, I think that you should then rewrite it in a real mainstream way so that everybody does want to read it, because it's got so much great information.
Well, we did 2 MOOCs on Coursera, Ellen, Melvin, and I, a number of years ago, and they've got over 1,400,000 people from 215 countries that have, have gotten onto it. And the key was my forcing Coursera to redo some of the stuff, because I said, look, in my world of emotions and relationships, we have to work with emotions and relationships.
Yeah.
So it's not just
Sorry.
It's a lot of assignments and practice.
I'm getting the we're out of time.
Okay.
Richard Boyatzis, thank you. I'd love to have you back again. Wouldn't we, Rebecca, and talk some more about this. It is so critical.
It is.
Probably one of the most important things in life. That's it for today, I'm afraid. The book is Helping People Change, Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth by Richard Boyatzis, Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Houston, published by Harvard Business Review. And believe me, it's not just for business or organizations, it's for all of us. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time 2 weeks from now. Till then, it's goodbye from me.
And me, Rebecca Schaper.